again, folks. Skillfulmission here. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my brand new Bible series entitled The Kings, or more specifically, The Kings of Judah. That's right, folks. In this new Bible series of mine, we're going to be taking a look at all of the kings of Judah, or the southern kingdom, after the kingdom of Israel split into two, after King Solomon had died and his son Rehoboam ascended to be king of Israel, but then a man named Jeroboam took 10 tribes with him, and that's how the kingdom of Judah, Israel split into two. The northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah. So, this series, I just want to go over a little introduction. This series is going to play out a little bit similar like my previous series, The Judges. The similarity being that I'm going to upload a new episode every Wednesday, but if I am unable to, for some unknown reason, I will upload it the Thursday or Friday of that week. Or if a king has a really big story that is very long, then I will cut that into two. So part one will be, I'll do part one, and then the next week will be part two. The difference being in this series is I won't read their story verse by verse in the Bible, but I will read verses once in a while to kind of reference and let you know where we're at in the story, and I will mention what chapter or book in the Bible or verse this part of the story is in, so you can go look it up for yourselves. And also, I think the reason why I did decide to do the kings of Judah instead of Israel is because there are some kings in Judah with some quite good redeeming qualities. So to say, there are some good kings, like really good kings from Judah. The kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, all the kings there were just flat out evil and wicked and bad. But here in Judah, we do have some good or okay kings we're going to look at. We're also going to look at all the bad kings, because Judah, no doubt, had some pretty wicked kings themselves, and I want to take a look at those as well. So I think we're going to learn a lot from this series, and that is the introduction. So without further ado, let's get right into this. I'm so excited to do this, and I hope you folks are too. If you do like this series, at the end of the video, hit that subscribe button for more content like this. Leave a like and leave a comment to let me know if you guys have any opinions. So, like I said, we're starting a new series entitled The Kings, or The Kings of Judah. And if you folks did not know, the first king of Judah after the kingdom split is Solomon's son Rehoboam. Now, some of these names I might not know how to pronounce, so please forgive me if I am wrong. But yes, the first king of Judah is Rehoboam. Now, I decided to skip over King Saul, King David, and King Solomon because we pretty much know all there is about those three kings, and that's when the kingdom of Israel was united under one. But before we get into Rehoboam's story, I think we need to take a little lesson back in time. We need to get some background on what led up to Rehoboam becoming king and how the kingdom split. So, before Rehoboam was even talked about, King Solomon, and this is in 1 Kings chapter 11, you start at verse 1, and this whole chapter talks about how Solomon started to, I guess you could say, fall apart with God, and also talks about the rise of a man named Jeroboam, and a prophet is going to tell him that when Solomon is gone, you will become king of Israel, and you will take 10 tribes of Israel with him. But let's talk about Solomon first. So it says in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, oh my gosh, sorry folks, and Hittites." So, Zidonians, there you go, that's the word. So, here we see in chapter 11 of 1 Kings that King Solomon is really not in a good position right now. You folks got to remember, under King Solomon, when he first became king, and throughout most of his reign, Israel was prospering immensely right now under the leadership and monarchy of King Solomon. He was a wise and great king, one of the greatest kings Israel ever had, and he was definitely a man that walked with God for most of his reign. But here, it says that Solomon, he's getting old as everyone else does, and this is pretty much Solomon's downfall. He loved a lot of strange women, specifically women from, as the Bible says, different countries. And these countries are, and these people are not the kind of people that God wants Israel to be together with. They don't want them molding together or living together or getting along with together. I mean, these people, God cast them out of Israel, and He didn't want Israel to have anything to do with these people for a good reason. And this is where Solomon makes a terrible decision. And if you go down to verse 4 of chapter 11, it says, "For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." Verse 5, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father." And it also talks about how he worshipped Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon, if you read on a little bit more. So here we have Solomon, whose heart was perfect with the Lord for much of his reign. Now that he is old, his wives from all these other countries, by the way, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which means he had 1,000 wives. I don't know who in their right mind would marry 1,000 women. I just really don't know. But here Solomon marries 1,000 wives, and I'm going to assume that most of these wives are pretty wicked and evil because they're from these wicked, evil countries that worship false gods. And so now that Solomon is old and he's weak and he's tired, his wives take advantage of this and they start making him worship all these false gods. And so Solomon has turned away from God and his heart is not perfect with him. If you go down to verse 9, chapter 11, it talks about how the Lord was angry with Solomon, and the Lord kind of lays out what is going to happen now because of what Solomon has done. If you read the next few verses, from verse 9 all the way to verse 14 or 13, it talks about how the Lord is telling Solomon that because you have done this, and I have already warned you about this, because you have done this abomination and this sin that I've already warned you not to do, I'm going to rend the kingdom away from you. Or basically, God is saying, I'm going to split the kingdom of Israel into two. But I'm not going to do it in your day. No. I'm going to do it when your son is reigning over Israel. Now, God did this for David's sake, because God loved David, Solomon's father, and he didn't want Solomon to really suffer while in his old age right now. But God says when he dies and when his son is reigning over Israel, that's when the kingdom's going to split. And he's going to lose 10 tribes of Israel, and they're going to go split and make their own kingdom. But also for David's sake, again, he's going to keep one kingdom, or one tribe, actually 2 tribes, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. They're going to keep for Solomon's son and his future generation to reign. So that's what's happening right now. And now if you go to verse 26 of chapter 11, it talks about a man named Jeroboam. Now don't get confused. Rehoboam and Jeroboam, they are not brothers. Jeroboam was the son of Nabat, an Ephraimite of Zerida, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah. So Jeroboam is the son of Nabat. This is apparently a servant of King Solomon. And if you read down from verse 26 and you pretty much read all the way to verse 40, it talks about how there was a prophet named Ahijah, that's his name, Ahijah, and he basically tells Jeroboam that because Solomon has sinned and he's gone after false gods, God is going to give you 10 tribes to form your own kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel. You will be king one day of your own kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel. That's basically what Ahijah the prophet is telling Jeroboam right now. And somehow King Solomon got word of this, and Solomon was trying to change God's plans, let's put it that way. And so if you read verse 40 of chapter 11, it says, Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So Solomon somehow found out that Jeroboam knew that he was going to be king of Israel. The kingdom was going to split, and Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam caught word of this, and Jeroboam fled to the king of Egypt and stayed in Egypt for many years, I'm assuming, until Solomon died. And then he would return back to Israel to take what the prophet said he would take. So that is where we pick up on Rehoboam, the first king of Judah. If you read verse 41 of 40 to 43 of chapter 11, talks about Solomon. He died, he rested with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead, in verse 43 of chapter 11. So chapter 12 is where our story picks up on Rehoboam, and it starts by It's talking about Rehoboam. He went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. So this is when he was going to be made king of Israel. And around this time, Jeroboam caught word that King Solomon had died and that Rehoboam, his son, was going to be made king of Israel. So at that moment, Jeroboam returned to Israel. And he basically told Rehoboam that, look, your father sinned against God, and I was told that I was going to be made king of Israel by the prophet Ahijah, and I was going to take 10 tribes with me. And if I remember this story correctly, word for word, I guess you could say, Rehoboam, at this time, at some point, he was trying to consult the old men who sat with Solomon, his father, trying to ask him what he should do, like give him some advice, I guess you could say, because I think at this time Jeroboam was not wanting to tax the nation of Israel really high, but Rehoboam was seriously considering that, so he wanted to consult the old men that sat with Solomon, his father. But instead, Rehoboam ignored the words of the old wise men that sat with Solomon, his father, and instead he consulted with the young men that he grew up with, maybe from when they were kids, or they were friends, and so he consulted with them and seeked after their advice. And so those young men convinced Rehoboam to, no, you know what? Tax the people. Tax them even more. You know, what could possibly go wrong if you tax them way more? And so pretty much because of this, 10 tribes of the nation of Israel decided to split from King Rehoboam. And they decided to split, make their own nation, make their own kingdom, and make Jeroboam their king. And so you kind of read about this in verse 16 of chapter 12. And this is where the kingdom splits. This is really the disastrous part, and this is the downfall pretty much of the whole nation of Israel. This is when the country, the whole kingdom splits into two. And so Jeroboam takes 10 tribes of Israel with him to form the northern kingdom of Israel. And Rehoboam, he keeps 2 tribes, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, and he forms the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Israel right now is not in a good state, so to say. And so Rehoboam is now king of Judah, and Jeroboam is now king of Israel. And pretty much from the start, Jeroboam is just a disastrous king. He's pretty evil and wicked. For starters, he builds 2 golden calves once the nation of Israel is formed, the northern kingdom. And he has the gall to tell the Israelites that, behold, these are your gods, the gods that brought you out of the land of Egypt and have protected you and provided for you. Worship them. So immediately after the northern kingdom of Israel split from the southern kingdom, it's just downhill from there, and it just gets worse because every king that the northern kingdom had would be terrible, wicked, and evil from that day on. So Israel's not doing good. But we're not talking about Jeroboam. I think I'm going a little off track. Let's get back to Rehoboam. And so Rehoboam, he tries at one point with 180,000 men from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin to try and forcefully take back the northern tribes of Israel back to Judah, or the southern kingdom. He's trying to unite all of Israel back together. Fortunately, it doesn't really go according to plan. And so Rehoboam is unsuccessful in his effort to reunite all of the tribes of Israel together. So from this point on, kingdom of Israel and kingdom of Judah would remain separated for pretty much most of their history up until now. Okay, and when you get to chapter 14, in verse 21, by the way, what I just talked about, all that can be found in chapter 12 and chapter 13 if you just read through all of that. So we're back to Rehoboam and his story. So, like I said, 1 Kings chapter 14, you start at verse 21. And Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in the city of Jerusalem, or the city of Jerusalem. So Rehoboam's 41, pretty old in my opinion, and he reigned 17 years, so definitely not the exact same length as his grandfather David and his father Solomon. And if you go down to verse 22, it's not looking good for Judah right now. You got to realize Rehoboam, first off, he was not really a good king. In fact, he did some pretty wicked things in the sight of the Lord. In fact, the whole southern kingdom at this time was doing evil in the sight of the Lord. If you read verse 22 and a couple verses beyond that, it says, "And Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they had committed above all that their fathers had done. For they also built them high places and images and groves on every high hill and under every green tree." So right now they're building up high images, they're worshiping and sacrificing to false idols and all that garbage stuff that nations who turn their back on God do. Verse 24, "And there were also sodomites," or homosexuals, "in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out before the children of Israel." So you might think Israel's not doing good right now, but Judah isn't really in a pretty state right now under King Rehoboam either. In fact, it's going pretty terrible, and they're sinning against God immensely. And it only gets worse from here. Verse 25 of chapter 14, and by the way, this is the 5th year of King Rehoboam's reign. "And it came to pass in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem." So apparently Shishak is still king of Egypt when Rehoboam was king. At the time when Jeroboam fled to Egypt, Shishak was king, and apparently he still is king of Egypt. Verse 26, "And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house. He even took away all, and he took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made." So basically, Shishak invaded Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judah, and he just took all the treasures of the Lord's house, the king's house, and he took away all the beautiful, probably beautiful shields of gold that King Solomon, Rehoboam's father, had made, which is just a big blow, and it just seems like just a huge embarrassment in my opinion. And it says in verse 27, "And King Rehoboam made in their stead brazen shields," or brassen shields, "and committed them unto the hands of the chief of the guard, which kept the door of the king's house." Brazen or brassen, I'm pretty sure it's not that much more beautiful than gold is. I'm sure gold is exquisite and just beautiful, but you just got to work with what you have. And so pretty much, to be honest, that's pretty much all of King Rehoboam's story. If you read on the last few verses, up until like verse 31, it talks about, "And Rehoboam slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and his mother's name was Naamah, of an Ammonitess, and Abijam his son reigned in his stead." So that's pretty much where Rehoboam's story comes to an end. There's not really much to talk about except for the fact that, this is a crucial point in Israel's history where the kingdom splits into two. And Rehoboam has some significance because he's the first king of Judah, the southern kingdom, so that's why I think he has some sort of significance. But in terms of whether he was a good, okay, or bad king, he was no doubt more of a bad king than anything else, because at the time of his reign, Judah really sinned against God immensely, and he did nothing to reverse that or change his ways. So that's why he's on the tier of bad kings of Judah, in my opinion. And for the most part, it gets pretty bad up until we get to a few good kings, but then it always just gets worse. You folks know how this goes, or maybe you don't. That's why we're doing this series. And like I said, that is the end of the story of King Rehoboam. Next week we're going to talk about his son Abijam, I think that's how you say his name, and his reign over Judah. I almost said Israel. Kingdom of Judah. So if you folks enjoyed this video, and if you like to see more from this series, subscribe, join the Eyes today, leave a like, comment, let me know if you have anything to say, and see you folks in the next video, whatever I make. God bless you all.